Hello, Huntley 158. We made it. I want to thank all of our students and families, our readers and community partners for participating in Raiders Read Together this summer. We had so much fun, and I hope you did too. As the story of Charlie Bucket and Willy Wonka comes to a close, I want to encourage all our students to carry this enthusiasm for reading and learning with them as we embark on the 22-23 school year. I hope you will continue to lean on the tools and tricks we utilize throughout the summer to enhance your literacy skills as we head back into the classrooms. I hope we continue to celebrate partnerships and teamwork all across our community. But most of all, I hope we have all been reminded of the magic that comes from a good book and making memories as a family. Before we leave you today, don't forget to gather your golden tickets, answer the questions on the back, and drop them off at your school's open house night. Those tickets will be entered into a raffle for our students to win some exciting prizes on the first day of school. And don't forget to stop by the Movie in the Park tonight at Parasec Park to join Huntley Public Library and the Village of Huntley for a screening of our favorite classic adventure, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Once again, thank you for your participation this summer. You all helped make this a special journey. We can't wait to see you back in the buildings on August 17th and 18th. It's going to be a great year here in Huntley 158. Let's get started with our final chapter, Chapter 30, Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass elevator was now hovering high over the town. Inside the elevator stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. "How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused and he turned around and looked at Charlie with a most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh yes," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the world." "I'm very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I'm very pleased indeed to hear you say that. And now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes, and he said, "You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words would come out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. "I'm really giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him?" gasped Grandpa Joe. "You must be joking." "Oh, I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious." But why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie?" "Listen," Mr. Wonka said. "I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who's going to run the factory when I get old enough to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for a chance to come in and take over for me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He'll try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one whom I can tell all my most precious candy-making secrets while I'm still alive." "So is that why you sent out the golden tickets?" cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked best at the end of the day would be the winner." "But Mr. Wonka," stammered Grandpa Joe, "do you really and truly mean that you're giving this whole enormous factory to little Charlie after all?" "There's no time for arguments," cried Mr. Wonka. "We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family, Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself." "Where do you live, Charlie?" Charlie peered down through the glass elevator at the snow-covered houses that lay below. "It's over there," he said, pointing. "It's that little tiny cottage right on the edge of the town, the tiny little one." "I see it," cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons, and the elevator shot down towards Charlie's house. "I'm afraid my mother won't come with us," said Charlie sadly. "Why ever not?" "Because she won't leave Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, and Grandma Josephine. But they must come too." "They can't," Charlie said. "They're very old, and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. "Then we'll take the whole bed as well, with them in it," said Mr. Wonka. "There's plenty of room in this elevator for a bed." "You couldn't get the bed out of the house," said Grandpa Joe. "It won't go through the door." "You mustn't despair," cried Mr. Wonka. "Nothing's impossible. Now you wait and see." The elevator was now hovering over the roof of the Buckets' little house. "What are you going to do?" cried Charlie. "I'm going right on it to fetch them," said Mr. Wonka. "How?" asked Grandpa Joe. "Through the roof," said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. "No!" shouted Charlie. "Stop!" shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash! The elevator went right through the roof of the house into the old person's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in a bed, and each one of them thought this was the end of the world. Grandma Georgina fainted, Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth, and Grandpa George put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. "Save us!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Calm yourself, my dear darling wife," said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the elevator. "It's only us." "Mother!" cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. "Mother, Mother, listen to what happened. We're all going to live with Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him run it, and he's given it all to me. And, "What are you talking about?" said Mrs. Bucket. "Just look at our house," cried poor Mr. Bucket. "It's in ruins." "My dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand, "I'm so glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it anyway again." "Who is this crazy man?" screamed Grandma Josephine. "He could have killed us all." "This," said Grandpa Joe, "is Mr. Willy Wonka himself." It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had happened to them all day. And even then they refused to ride back to the factory in the elevator. "I'd rather die in bed," shouted Grandma Josephine. "So would I," cried Grandma Georgina. "I refuse to go," announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the elevator. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in right after it. Then they all got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed the button. The doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed, and the elevator rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the 3 old people who were still petrified with fear. "Please don't be frightened," he said. "It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family is starving." "Anything to eat?" cried Charlie, laughing. "Oh, you just wait and see."